joins a panel on how political candidates use language. This discussion at the New York Public Library is about an hour and a half.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul Holdengraber, and I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the New York Public Library, now known as Live from the New York Public Library. This morning, I made my long 25-minute introduction, so now you will have about 1 minute of me on stage. Some people have been wondering why we have a ping-pong table in this room. It's pretty simple. It's just a question of repartee. That's what we're all about here, back and forth, which I hope will happen on stage. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce the man who made today possible, Andras Szanto.
Thank you. That's an exaggeration. It's our speakers who made the day possible. But I'm delighted the public library is into branding. Ping pong table is an example of that. This morning, Paul actually promised that what he aims to do here is levitate this heavy building. I said we won't be able to levitate the building, but perhaps we can levitate George Orwell. We are, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we have just come off an extraordinary morning panel, which is a kind of tour of propaganda through the ages. It was thoroughly enjoyable, and for those of you who weren't here, you can, of course, catch it soon on the web. And I should mention that in addition to the 500 or so people here in the room, we have a worldwide audience on the web, through television, and also in Second Life, the virtual community. More about that later. Again, at risk of repeating myself from this morning, this public conference really comes to you from live from the New York Public Library, but it is co-organized and was really sparked through the collaboration of a group of journalism schools and their deans who felt that, let's just say, that there was a widening gulf between politics and reality, politics and truth in this country, and there's something to be done about that, and perhaps journalists in particular can help in that work. The schools that have been particularly closely involved are the graduate schools of journalism at UC Berkeley, at USC Annenberg School for Communication, and Columbia University. Their deans are up here today moderating the panels, and I want to thank them for their hard work. We're here to diagnose symptoms of propaganda, disinformation, manipulative rhetoric on the American political landscape, and we're doing this as part of a series of events, of which this is just one. But this is really, this panel this afternoon is where the rubber really hits the road, because we looked back to the past this morning, but now we're here in the now talking about politics and propaganda in the United States at this time. In this next panel, what we're beginning to focus on, I'd like to call this the PhD face-off, because we have PhDs galore in this panel. And these are our scientists who are going to, shall we say, look under the hood of political communication. They will tell us a little bit about what is it that science, both social science, cognitive science, linguistics, are able to say to us today about how political messages are framed and then decoded by audiences, how this is integrated into our political discourse today in ways that are stunningly complex, and I appreciate their efforts in trying to boil it all down for us today. The next panel is going to focus on the media, both its failings, but hopefully also its promise in restoring honesty and decency and truth to America's public debates. Now, I want to say that this is a first salvo, this event, but there's another component of what we're doing here today, which is we're launching a book, an anthology of essays that features several of the speakers, but also additional ones. It's titled What Orwell Didn't Know, Propaganda in the New Face of American Politics. I'm quite proud of it, and I encourage you please to buy it. I should mention that many authors in this book, as well as others on stage, have signed copies of their books, which you can purchase over there to my right. So please go ahead and help support our publishing industry. It needs you. A reminder on logistics. On your seats, you will have discovered these comments and questions cards. And they are to facilitate what will inevitably be an all too short but hopefully very exciting question and answer period. So we ask you to, in about an hour from now, when you've absorbed the panel, to please write any comments and questions you may have. My colleagues will collect these and bring them to me. I will try to cull from them questions that I believe are really good. I'm sure there will be many more. Those that we cannot ask, we will try to publish or make available in some form. There are also detailed biographies of our speakers in your packets. Our attendance today is so extraordinarily high. I think we have more than 900 people registered over the course of the day, that we ask you that some of you may have to share these packets, but please help us with that and also help us save some trees. Another small logistical item, those of you who are staying for the next panel, which starts at 4 p.m., we ask you that you stay for a few minutes in your seat after this panel so that the people here at the Public Library can swipe your tickets or whatever it is that they have to do. And finally, on a regretful note, I'm very sad, but I have to announce that Deborah Tannen, who I know many of you were anticipating to join us in today's conference, valiantly struggled against pneumonia last week. She's okay, but she got as far as the airport and realized that she has no strength to take her briefcase out of her car, and I think she made the right decision to stay behind. It's very regrettable, but I'm still sure we will have a very exciting panel. In fact, several of her colleagues are on the panel, and she sends her regrets to you. The moderator of this next panel is Nicholas Lemann, or Nick Lemann, as we call him. He is the Dean of the Columbia Journalism School and an esteemed journalist, author of a number of books, several of which are available, signed here today, and of course a regular contributor to the New Yorker magazine. So I'd now like to invite him and his panel up to the stage, and Nick, it's all yours. Thank you very much. Enjoy.
Do we put these in front?
Yes. This is the magic button, Andras. Okay. Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'll just introduce very briefly. This, in a certain way, is the PhD panel, and in a certain way, it's the fun panel, because we have got a lot of audio-visual material that you're going to see and hear starting very soon. By way of introduction, I, as a journalist, have been very interested in this subject of political language for quite some time. I've kind of moved in and out of covering politics per se, but if there's a sort of light bulb moment, in 1980, everyone will have forgotten, and as they should, there was a brief moment in the spring of 1980 when Gerald Ford was going to come out of retirement and run for president. So he holed up in a townhouse on Lafayette Square in Washington. I was a reporter for the Washington Post, and I was sent to do a stakeout, outside this townhouse. And, people kept coming and going all day. So I had this picture in my mind of he'd be there, and first the union leaders would come, and then the governors of states would come, and then the heads of congressional committees would come, and then the big city bosses would come. But no, they didn't come. Instead, it was a procession of the pollsters came, and then the advertising people came, and then the marketing specialists came, and I really thought politics has changed in some way. Although I hope we'll return to this question of how much has it changed and try to be precise about it. In 2000, I came back into covering politics for the New Yorker and kind of re-entered this subject, and some of my tutors are here on this panel. I wrote a story. I interviewed Deborah Tannen, George Lakoff, and Frank Luntz, not Drew, that year, and wrote a piece in the New Yorker called The Word Lab, primarily about Frank, although secondarily about George. We sort of made a deal in that piece where, for what I believed at the time and still believe was much less than your usual fee. It was practically nothing. We hired Frank, and he said, if you pay me a fee for a day, I will take you into one of my focus groups, and I'll show you how I can get a group of people who come in being for inheritance taxation, leave 2 hours later being against inheritance taxation, simply by changing the language we use to describe it. And he did, and that became the basis of this piece. Well, first I'll introduce the panelists, then I'll play a little audio clip. But I got very fascinated at that time, and I know many of you are too, with how words are used, especially through media of mass communications, in politics, and how effective they are, what the techniques are, what's kind of really going on under the surface of what we see when we see candidates speaking and advertising, and how effective is all this stuff. I want to spend time later on trying to be very precise about when did this all start, what's new, what's not new, is there a kind of new technology that's making politicians more effective at the use of language here, what's okay and what's not okay in a moral sense, if that's even applicable. In service of getting all those questions answered, I would just say now to the panelists, 10 to 12 minute opening presentations are important because the time will fly by. I will start sort of shifting in my chair and then harumphing and being even more interventionist as we get from 10 minutes to 11 minutes over into 12 minutes. Okay, so let me introduce in this order, just by reading from the program, because I understand you don't all have programs. George Lakoff, this gentleman, is Senior Fellow and co-founder of the Rockridge Institute and the Goldman Distinguished Professor of Cognitive Science and Linguistics at the University of California, Berkeley, where he studies the framing of issues in politics. He's one of the world's best-known linguists and a founder of the field of cognitive science. He has published hundreds of articles in numerous books on linguistics, psychology, poetics, philosophy, and mathematics. Among his works on mind and language are Thinking Points, Whose Freedom? The Battle Over America's Most Important Idea, Don't Think of an Elephant, Moral Politics, and Metaphors We Live By. His next book, The Political Mind, is an introduction to recent scientific results about the brain and mind that have a bearing on politics. As a private citizen, he helps progressive citizens groups, activists, and policymakers think through their values and principles, formulate policies, and frame issues to express their deepest beliefs more effectively. Frank Luntz, in the middle, has been called the hottest pollster in America by the Boston Globe and was named one of 4 top research minds by Business Week. He was the winner of the coveted Washington Post Crystal Ball Award for being the most accurate pundit in 1992. Luntz has written, supervised, and conducted more than 1,500 surveys, focus groups, and dial sessions in more than 24 countries and 4 continents over the past decade, and is the pioneer of the instant response focus group technique. He consults Fortune 100 companies, from General Motors to Federal Express, Disney to American Express, AT&T to Pfizer, Kroger supermarkets to McDonald's, and the entire soft drink and motion picture industries, as well as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, National Association of Manufacturers, and the Business Roundtable on communications and language. He also served as a consultant to the award-winning NBC hit show The West Wing. He's the somebody made me say that. He is the author of Words That Work. It's not what you say, it's what people hear. On this side, Drew Westen is a clinical personality and political psychologist and a professor in the departments of psychology, psychiatry, and behavioral sciences at Emory University. As the founder of Western Strategies, a consulting firm, he advises Democratic leaders and candidates. He holds a BA from Harvard College, an MA in social and political thought from the University of Sussex in England, and a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Michigan. He has been chief psychologist at Cambridge Hospital and an associate professor at Harvard Medical School. He's a blogger for the Huffington Post and a commentator on NPR's All Things Considered. His book, The Political Brain, The Role of Emotion in Deciding the Fate of the Nation, explores how politicians can capture the hearts and minds of voters through examples of what candidates have said or could have said in debate speeches and ads. He lives in Atlanta. Okay, so just to sort of set the mood and to get you thinking. I want you to be thinking, first of all, I'm not going to tell you what this is that I'm about to play, although I think 90% of you will guess it instantly. I will reveal at the end. Think about two questions. First, is what you're about to hear propaganda, or is it reality-based politics, or is it both, or is it neither? And second of all, the technique of using words to manipulate the public through media of mass communications, who invented it and when, and what are the points when the game got to a higher level? So this is to sort of set a baseline for that discussion, and I hope this button works.
My friends, since my annual message to the Congress on January 4th last, I have not addressed the general public over the air. In the many weeks since that time, the Congress has devoted itself to the arduous task of formulating legislation necessary to the country's welfare. It has made and is making distinct progress. The job of creating a program for the nation's welfare is in some respects like the building of a ship. At different points on the coast where I often visit, they build great seagoing ships. And when one of these ships is under construction and the steel frames have been set in the keel, it is difficult for a person who does not know ships to tell how it will finally look when it is sailing the high seas. It may seem confused to some, but out of the multitude of detailed parts that go into the making of the structure, the creation of a useful instrument for man ultimately comes. It is that way with the making of a national policy. The objective of the nation has greatly changed in 3 years. Before that time, individual self-interest and group selfishness were paramount in public thinking. The general good was at a discount. 3 years of hard thinking have changed the picture. More and more people, because of clearer thinking and a better understanding, are considering the whole rather than a mere part, a part relating to one section, or to one crop, or to one industry, or to one individual private occupation. That is a tremendous gain for the principles of democracy, for the overwhelming majority of people in this country know how to sift the wheat from the chaff in what they hear and in what they read. We have, in the darkest moments of our national trials, retained our faith in our own ability to master our own destiny. Fear is vanishing. Confidence is growing on every side. Renewed faith in the vast possibilities of human beings to improve their material and spiritual status through the instrumentality of the democratic form of government. That faith is receiving its just reward. For that, we can be thankful to the God who watches over America.
So, he's good, huh? That is from Franklin D. Roosevelt's fireside chat over the radio in 1935, where he essentially unveiled what became the Social Security system. So one might say, just to be provocative, here's a politician who masters a new medium of mass communications, the radio, allows him to reach past anybody else directly to the American people. He's so power hungry that he runs for president 4 times, which nobody's ever done, and wins all 4 times. He expands the power of the state tremendously. This is the single biggest government program, domestic program, has become that. He never says that. He instead compares it to a great seagoing vessel and says God himself has blessed the idea. Are we horrified, or do we wish that we could have more politicians like this? Just food for thought, and over to you, George.
Okay. Thanks, Nick. Let me begin with the obligatory Orwell slide. See? Here we go. Okay, that's 1984. This is 2007. That's from an army base in the South. Obedience is freedom. This is from someone running for president. You know, Rudy Giuliani. Freedom is about authority. Now, the point that Nick was making is a powerful one. Framing and use of metaphor is necessary to say what you believe. And the reason for that is a very simple one, though it's often missed because most people don't know very much about what's been discovered in cognitive science and in neuroscience in the last 30 years. The basic finding is this. Surprise, you think with your brain, maybe except for certain politicians who use other parts of their anatomy, but even they think with their brains, and most thought is unconscious below the level of consciousness, about 98%. And that is a remarkable, important fact. Now, Orwell, in trying to deal with issues of doublethink and newspeak and so on, came out with the essay we're talking about today, Politics in the English Language. And what he was saying there was something that isn't true, I'm sad to say. That is, he said that the problem was bad habits of foolish thought, inaccurate, slovenly, dull, pretentious, ungraceful, meaningless language that he called the decay of language. He said this led to political propaganda and its effects. And to cure it, you just had to let the meaning choose the word. And, you know, he never read the modern propagandists who write so very well, the David Brookses and Peggy Noonans of the world. And this view is actually a naive and dangerous view because it comes from the Enlightenment. And it's a fallacy. The Enlightenment was wonderful for its politics. This country was founded on the basis of Enlightenment ideas about freedom, about equality, about balance of powers, and so on. But the Enlightenment had a false view of reason. And it's still there, and it's still out there, often in the media, often in the Democratic Party, and in all sorts of folks. Many distinguished newspapers have the idea that reason is conscious, that it's universal, that it's logical, that it's literal, it fits the world, that it's unemotional, that emotion gets in the way of reason, that it's disembodied, and that it's interest-based, that reason is there to serve your interests. And one horrible thing about this is you see it in the Democratic Party a great deal. That is, if you believe this, you'll think all you need to do is tell people the facts and the figures, and then they'll reason to the right conclusion, right? Wrong. I mean, we've seen this certainly in the last 2 elections, but we see it all the time. And the reason is that the cognitive and brain sciences have shown that this view of reason is just false in a very deep way, and not just false in a simple way. It's false in every single detail. Every detail. So, what is reason? First, 98% unconscious. That is, most of the thought and the reasoning you do is not accessible to your consciousness. And I don't just mean things that you hear that you are not conscious of. I mean most of the ideas that you have, the concepts that you have, are unconscious. You don't know your own system of concepts, right? Very important. I don't know mine. We're studying it, trying to figure it out. We've made a lot of progress in it, but it's still hard to figure it out. Understanding what your system of concepts in is hard. Secondly, reason requires emotion, and emotion is not always conscious. One of the things you'll hear from Drew Westen is emotion can be unconscious. This has really been studied dramatically, most dramatically, by Antonio Damasio, the country's perhaps leading neuroscientist, in a book called Descartes' Error. And what Antonio pointed out was this. He studied people who had brain damage, strokes, accidents, where they lost their ability to feel. They lost their ability to feel emotions. And it turned out they could not be rational. Why? Think about this. Suppose you are trying to figure out, you have a purpose, and you're trying to figure out what your purposes are. Well, if you don't know if you're going to be happy or sad if that happens, what are you going to do? How do you reason? If you don't know if other people are going to be angry at you or happy with you, what are you going to do? You can't reason. And that is the truth. Reason, rationality, absolutely requires emotion, and the pathways have begun to be figured out in great detail that shows in the brain how this works. Now, the next part of this is that we have different worldviews. We don't all think the same. It turns out that movement conservatives and strong progressives do not see the world in the same way. Surprise. You go on the TV shows, they talk right past each other, but it's because they see the world differently. They have different understandings of what morality is. And it's important to understand politics is about morality. Every politician who proposes some policy does it because he says it's right. Nobody gets up there and says, I've got a bad policy for you. It's evil, it's wrong, here's what I propose, right? Nobody does this. It's about morality. And all of the arguments, every argument that's made for a proposal comes back to a moral position. And we have two very different moral positions happening in this country. And one of the most important findings we have is that just about every one of us has versions of both of them in our heads. And the reason that we can have this is a little fact about the brain. It's called mutual inhibition. That is, you can have two structures in the brain where each neurally inhibits the other. If this is active, it'll inactivate that. If this is active, it'll inactivate that. And then they can be about different subject matters. Some people can be progressive in one area, conservative in another area, and might not ever know that they're switching back and forth. And they might call themselves conservative and be progressive in 5 different areas, or call themselves liberals and be conservatives in 3 or 4 different areas. That happens, and as a result, there is no left to right line. When people say there's a middle, it's not there. There is no ideology of the middle. Think for a minute about 2 people called moderates, Chuck Hagel and Joe Lieberman. Right? They agree on nothing. Hagel, a conservative who's against the war, Lieberman, a liberal who's for the war. Right? They're both moderates. There is no ideology of the middle. You have people who have both progressive and conservative views, who have all sorts of combinations, and some people are almost all one, and some people are almost all the other. But it is not the case that you have a left to right view, and that's important for the Democratic Party. Democrats tend to think that if you move to the right, you'll get more votes. Republicans understand that they don't have to move to the left to get more votes. They understand this fact. The Democrats need to learn it. Very, very important part of this. Another one is that you always think using frames. Every word is defined with respect to a frame, like bottle. Okay, what is a bottle? It's a container like this. You can put liquid in, drink it out. I can hold it like this. It's made of a certain number of things. That's all you know about bottle. If I say he picked up the bottle, you understand it because you understand that frame. Every single word. If I say a word, it activates a frame. So, for example, when I teach this, what I do is I tell my students, I give them a problem. And the problem is this. Ready? Don't think of an elephant. Whatever you do, do not think of an elephant. Right? The word elephant is going to activate that frame and that image even if you negate it. The first thing you need to know is if you negate or even question a word that has a frame associated with it, you're going to activate that frame. So if somebody gives you a conservative frame and you're a liberal and you use their words, you'll be activating their frame and their worldview. Crucial. Now, why does this matter? Here are some more examples of this. Here are examples of the Democrats' arguments for troop withdrawal. It doesn't serve our interests. War was illegitimate based on false information. It's unwinnable, right? Each one uses the other side's frame. It says, this is about our interests. War was legitimate. So here are the other arguments. Okay? Here's the Republican frame. We have vital interests in Iraq. The war is legitimate, authorized by Congress, based on the information available, and it's winnable. Okay? That is a coherent, consistent frame. If you take the negation of each of those statements, they don't form a single frame. They're not consistent, and they're using this frame. In short, what's happening is the Democratic arguments are activating the Republicans' frames. And this happens all the time. Deborah Tannen, had she been able to come today, was going to talk about her book, The Argument Culture, which uses the metaphor that fairness is balance, and that you always have to have two positions, fair and balanced, right? In order to have two positions on one issue, you need the same frame. So if you're Fox News, you say, what do you think should be done about the war on terror? You know, and there's always the war on terror. That's that frame. Are you for or against the death tax? You know, it's the death tax whether you're for or against. And that's the point. If you have a TV show where you have to be balanced, one or the other, and somebody sets the frame, it has to be one frame, that frame is most likely going to come from one side or the other, and you won't see it. Frames are in your brain. You think with your brains physically. All thought is physical. Frames are physical. Metaphors are physical. You can't do anything else. They are physically there in your brain. And once they're there, you cannot erase them. You can't say, war on terror, be gone. Poof. It doesn't work. It's there. The only thing you can do is have alternative framings that can get around it, or a way to make fun of it or put it down in some way and add to the framing of it. But those are your choices. It's not going to go away. You can't erase it. You could talk about occupation all the time, and it's very difficult to get people to do it, and so on. Okay, what I'd like to do perhaps a little later is talk about why the Democrats surrender in advance. There's a reason for this, and it has to do with Enlightenment reason, but we'll get to that in a while.
So that's a good cliffhanger, and I will ask you later. I'll ask. Frank.
I have nothing to say because I'm still thinking of an elephant. I must tell you, as the token, often angry, often upset, but still occasionally a Republican in this room, I understand how Dr. Kevorkian feels at an AARP convention. And sitting with up here with George Soros down there, I've never been this close to that much money. Would you adopt me, please? I'm going to show you some language, some work that I've been doing. But it is not just about words that matter. It's also about presentation. When you wear a tie, people react to you, or when you don't. Whether you are formal or informal, whether you read a speech or notes or nothing at all, people do have a reaction to it. And I like to use John Edwards as the example because he still is, even though he's not doing well in the polls, by applause. How many of you are backing Edwards for the presidency? How many of you are backing Obama? How many of you are backing Hillary? How many of you are backing Mike Huckabee? I prepped them all for that one, by the way. Kucinich. The name is actually Kucinich, but that's neither here nor there. Joe Biden. Oh, Senator Biden, how are you? You see, that's how Biden has so little support now that he's actually got to shout out his own name. But thank you very much for coming. How many of you are supporting Rudy Giuliani? Do you realize that he got more boos than cheers here? It's been nice knowing you. I'll see you guys later. John Edwards, when he, back in the 2004, and I can't do it, actually I can do it, well no I won't. He would look everyone straight in the eye. His whole demeanor, his whole communication is one of a trial lawyer. And he's always closing. It's always as though it's before a jury. And I study this because part of my job is to understand all of communication, not just words. And so he'll make eye contact with every person in the room, and he will not look away until he sees a person like that gentleman with the beard. He starts to nod. Then Edwards, in his mind, goes, got him. I can then move to the woman in the blue until she starts to nod. Now she's smiling, so I got her. And he moves all the way across, and the guy's amazing. Giuliani paces really back and forth. He sometimes looks at the audience, sometimes doesn't. Edwards makes eye contact all the time. But when you put him in a chair, as they did in 2004, when he debated Dick Cheney and also in his last Democratic debate, he was constantly doing this, constantly trying to stand up because he doesn't think as well seated. I said it's because he had brains in his butt and he couldn't breathe. But he is better standing. Now, someone like George Bush is not a good communicator. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. I was asked by the New York Post, who may even be here, what does Bush need to do to win the election in 2004? I said only 3 things: a noun, a verb, and some sort of punctuation. And yet he still won. As bad as his... Anyway, 2004, do you guys really think he lost in 2004? I like doing this because then the audience gets to see just how out of the mainstream people in the room are. No. Actually, you are. Hillary Clinton is going to be the next president of the United States. Wait a minute. I got booed when I said Hillary Clinton is going to be the next president? She is. But the problem, the challenge, actually, the interesting thing is, if an independent or a moderate or someone who is undecided were tuning in right now and they heard this heckling from the audience, it doesn't win their support. It doesn't turn them on. The average American hates that. The average American thinks that politics has become so negative, so personal, so destructive, that when they hear that kind of heckling, they think it's childish, and it's mean, and it's dispiriting. We're going to have a very high turnout in 2008, but I'm not, for some of the right reasons, because it really matters. It's not just language, it's policy. But when I try to engage in conversation, and I said this to Nick, because I really didn't want to be here, because I told you that this was going to happen. And it's not fun, because it depresses me. I don't look at this as an insult on me if there's hissing or booing. I look at this and I wonder what lesson that's teaching kids about respect and, most importantly, the word civility. The willingness to hear other points of view, and even if you disagree with them, to at least accept that they are generated for a reason. I think that the Republicans have problems. I think the Democrats have problems. And I'm longing for a day when we can have a really spirited discussion and debate, and then go out and sit down together as friends and share a drink. And so let me show you some of the stuff that I came here to show you.
Thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you very much. That's my dad, by the way. This is language, and it's going to surprise you, but I'm going to show you why Hillary Clinton is such a good communicator. And I've got 6 segments, and we use something called instant response, and it's almost the size of this device. And you guys know that this is how I work to develop language. And I've been testing all the debates, and this is among, if not the single best soundbite You're going to see lines that are moving across the screen. The higher that the lines go, the more favorable the response, because people are reacting. They've got a device. They're watching the video, and they turn it up and down whether they want to vote for or against them. Watch how high the lines climb. Watch how sharp they climb. This is one of the most favorable reactions to any statement of any political candidate, because it puts all the words together effectively. Let's see if we can't roll that clip. It's a very short...
You know, it is hard to disagree with anything that has been said, but let me just put this in perspective. If HIV/AIDS were the leading cause of death of white women between the ages of 25 and 34, there would be an outraged outcry in this country.
Now, if you can pause that for a moment. She's delivering that speech to a primarily African-American audience. And she is in that frame, to use Professor Lakoff's words, and these guys are brilliant. I feel like I now know what an Oreo feels like, sitting between these two guys. She fashions the language, so she makes a statement, and she plays into a sense of guilt, and she also plays into something that's incredibly declarative and assertive, and she does so with such emotion, and that was the home run so far of election 2008, that phrase. And I'm going to show you now healthcare. She's going to applaud the individuals who raised the question. She's going to mention certain diseases. She's going to declare an enemy, which are the pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies. She's going to talk about the principles of what healthcare should be, and then she's going to be declarative at the end. This is a 45-second response. One other thing about Hillary Clinton. You could cook a minute egg to her responses in these debates. She is so well disciplined. The minute waltz, you start it, you end it, right as the minute waltz ends, she's finishing. You compare that to Bill Richardson, the guy is still in Philadelphia debating from last week. Because there's a lesson. When the bell goes off in one of these debates, you all expect them to be finished. And if they can't explain it to you in 1 minute, you get angry. Some of these candidates haven't figured that out. Let's roll that Hillary clip so you can see perfect language on health care.
Well, first, I want to thank Mark and Joel and Charity and Kim and Mike. You know, it's not easy coming in front of the entire world and talking about your Alzheimer's or your diabetes or your breast cancer or your disability. But the fact that this is happening in a country as rich as ours is just a national disgrace. And yes, I did try in '93 and '94, and I like to say I have the scars to show for it, but I learned a lot about what we have to do. And having a plan, yes, that's part of it, but more important, we have to have a sense of national commitment that universal health care is an American value. We have to quit being told by special interests like the insurance companies and the drug companies that somehow we can't do what most other developed countries do, which is cover everybody and provide decency and respect to every single person in this country with health care.
Watch this.
We got another question on health care.
Decency and respect, that is a perfect frame, a perfect set of communication. You use frame, I use context in terms of the words that we use. But now I'm going to show you what happens if it isn't perfect. And you may have seen this is the challenge that Obama gave to Senator Clinton when she didn't answer the question on the issue of the archives. And I say this to you because if you look programmed, if you look rehearsed, if you're unclear or seem to try to escape the question, voters in this election cycle are brutal to you. It's not that Obama's response was so good, it's that Senator Clinton's response was so bad, and then Obama took advantage of it. Let's roll this clip.
But there was a letter written by President Clinton specifically asking that any communication between you and the president not be made available to the public until 2012. Would you lift that ban?
Well, that's not my decision to make, and I don't believe that any president or first lady ever has, but certainly we'll move as quickly as our circumstances and the processes of the National Archives permits.
Senator Obama, your hands up.
Well, look, I'm glad that Hillary took the phrase, turn the page. It's a good one, but this is an example of not turning the page. We have just gone through one of the most secretive administrations in our history. And not releasing, I think, these records. At the same time, Hillary, as you're making the claim that this is the basis for your experience, I think is a problem. Part of what we have to do is invite the American people back to participate in their government again. Part of what we need to do is rebuild trust in our government again. And that means being open and transparent and accountable to the American people. And that's one of the hallmarks of my previous work in the state legislature, in the United States Senate, making sure that Americans know where our money is going, what earmarks are out there, what kinds of pork barrel spending is being done, who's bundling money for who. And that, I think, is part of the job of the next president, is making Americans believe that our government is working for them, because right now they don't feel like it's working for them. They feel like it's working for special interests and it's working for corporations. One last point I want to make. Part of the reason that Republicans, I think, are...
It was an incredible response, because it stated how that was a Democratic primary debate, and it stated how Democrats felt. And the key word in all of this is trust. They feel like they've lost trust in this administration, in this government, and they want that trust back. Let me just do 30 seconds. The problem now going forward is, I read Daily Kos and I read MoveOn.org, and I'm often in it and focused on it. They don't realize, and you in this audience probably have a certain assumption about what I do and who I talk to, and you guys actually have no idea how often I have had conversations with, discussions with Democrats in the House and in the Senate, even the presidential candidates. But that doesn't matter for some people, because they are just so angry. I will tell you this. In fact, it's not even anger, because anger can be, at times, a good emotion. There's hatred in the lexicon today. We can achieve so much when we're working together. We can achieve so much in a debate. And I do believe that Senator Clinton will be the next president. But we will not achieve anything if the next administration breeds the same amount of hate that we have now. In no circumstance whatsoever does hatred help. It only hurts. It only divides. So do me a favor, New York City. A little bit less hatred. You know, fight it out. You're going to be successful. You all are going to be applauding and cheering in the next election night. Just don't. You know,
let's let Frank feel the love.
I got nothing to say, sir.
Frank, you're forming a question in my mind, which is about what seemed to be the very effective use of all this kind of warlike language by this administration, particularly after 9/11, but I'll ask that later. Drew.
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is, Frank, you're good enough, you're smart enough, and doggone it, I like you.
Yeah, but don't touch me in the future.
Didn't mean to invade your space. Sorry about that. As a psychologist, I can't really stop myself from beginning with an experiment, so that's what I'd like to do. The subjects are all of you. Let's see if I can get this. We get the experiment slide up. Okay. I'd like you to remember the following pairs of words: ocean, moon; tie, glasses; face, floor. Okay, do you all have those in mind? And now I want you to count backwards in your head from 100 to 95. Just nod when you get there. Okay, good. Got some mathematicians in the room. Now, when I raise my hand, what I want you to do, as soon as I raise my hand, is just to say out loud, and you really need to say it out loud, the first automobile that comes to your mind. Are you ready? Okay, no consensus. It fits with what we saw, I think, which is this is clearly a Democratic crowd. And now what I'd like to do is I'm going to raise my hand, and this time, again, as soon as my hand goes up, I'd like you just to shout out the first laundry detergent that comes to your mind. You ready? Well, isn't that interesting? Do you notice what percent said tide? I would estimate it at about 80, probably about 80%. That's kind of low for this experiment, probably because I used too many words in between. The market share of Tide is 41%. Procter & Gamble would love this experiment. You should tell them about it, Frank. The market share is 80%, and in a room from anywhere from 10 people all the way up to 2,000 people, I can consistently get somewhere between 80 and 95% of people to say Tide. Well, how did I do it? The way that I did it is I made use of a property of how our brains and how our minds work, and that has to do with networks of association. Networks of association are, I primed you using the word pair ocean-moon. What that did was to activate a network of associations that included ocean, moon, waves, and tide. Now, waves and tide were never active in your mind consciously. They were essentially at a higher state of latent unconscious activation. They'd just gone up in their level of activation because what a network of associations is nothing other than a network of, or an interconnected set of thoughts and images and ideas and memories and emotions that have been connected up typically through experience. When I then send laundry detergents, it activated the network of laundry detergents. You'll notice that there's only one thing at the intersection of those two networks. That is Tide. It's doubly activated. That's why it rose to consciousness. That's why most people in the room, double the number of the market share of Tide, said Tide. I might add to you that I often, in doing this experiment, this demonstration, will ask people why they said Tide, and I'll get a range of answers. You know, that's what my mother used, or that's what I have at home, or I just picture that orange box. The mistake you can very often get from focus groups is to ask people conscious questions about unconscious processes. That's one of the things that the Kerry team did in 2004 when they asked focus groups, you know, do you think he should respond to the Swift boat ads, or should he respond to Abu Ghraib? It's like asking someone, what do you think's happening in your pancreas right now? We have no more access to what's happening in those unconscious networks than we do in what's happening in our pancreas or our spleen. So it's not a good question to ask. Now, the next question I would ask is, actually, I just can't stop myself from doing this. This is just about a demonstration of what networks are active at Fox.
J-Lo's new song, Jenny from the Block, all about Lopez roots, about how she's still a neighborhood gal at heart. But folks from that street in New York, the Bronx section, sound more likely to give her a curb job than a blow job or a block party. The New York Post, we're sorry about that slip up there. I have no idea how that happened, but it won't happen again. And that's your news and the G Block, as Fox reports this Monday, November the 4th.
Now, the first thing I have to say is it couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. But the second is that actually, you know how he says, I don't know how that happened, but I can tell you it won't happen again. Well, actually, we do know how that happened, and that is it happened just the way I activated those networks before, and that is that block and blow start with the same three letters. Your brain is simultaneously, his brain was simultaneously activating both block and blow and anything else that began with BLO. There was apparently a second network active that was activated by Jennifer Lopez's undulating half-naked body that led to that Freudian slip. And that explains the convergence of those two networks. You can actually produce slips of the tongue like this about a third of the time experimentally. Now, suppose somebody knew how to shape and activate networks in voters. Well, somebody does, and they're called the GOP. And let me give you an example. This is a word that used to be central to what it meant to be a Democrat. This was the term that was used by Thomas Jefferson. It was used liberally by all the founders. But it became associated over a number of years with a number of rather unseemly phrases. So that liberal became associated with liberal elite, big government, tax and spend liberals, cut and run liberals, liberal special interests. All those things became associated because over time they were repeated over and over and over, so that they became, essentially they metastasized from the minds of really brilliant wordsmiths on one side of the aisle into even the
touching me again.
sorry. Must be something unconscious going on. But in any case,
No, it's very conscious.
But what essentially is happening is that those networks have essentially metastasized from the minds of conservative think tanks into the minds of even liberal and independent voters. So just to finish out the network, we've got Volvo driving, sushi eating, latte drinking, godless atheists. There you have it, a liberal. And that's why it has actually been over 40 years since a Democratic candidate for president called himself a liberal. That was Lyndon Johnson in 1964. You'll remember the Dodge from Michael Dukakis in 1988 and Hillary Clinton's impressive Dodge to say that she was a progressive in one of the debates. Now, the point I want to make about all this is that this may sound nefarious. I don't seem to be able to handle these well. This may sound nefarious, but the point can we stop that for a second? Oh, thank you. The point I want to make is that this is how our minds work. We activate networks, and we do it all the time in persuasion. There's nothing wrong with activating networks. If you couldn't have your networks activated, you couldn't think. And if you want to be persuasive with someone, to come back to the example that Nick gave us at the beginning, that was wonderfully persuasive language and intonation and visual imagery that FDR was activating in people's minds in that talk. And the line between what's propaganda and what's good persuasion is often a very difficult one to draw. There are lines that you can draw, but they're often difficult. I want to show you an example of the activation of networks that I think is one of the two most brilliant television ads ever produced, and this is Ronald Reagan's Morning in America.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes, more than at any time in the past 4 years. This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future. It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
Now, why was that so powerful? It was so powerful because it activated multi-sensory, multimodal networks of association that were all congruent with one another. It activated gut-level feelings about family, about marriage, about the generations, about the treatment of older people, about the hopefulness of people. Note that ad is remembered as Morning in America. But the first line is not, it's morning in America, it's morning again in America. It actually has an implicit negative tone to it that runs throughout. He doesn't say we're proud, we're strong, we're good. The announcer says prouder, stronger, better. Prouder, stronger, and better than what? Prouder, stronger, and better than the dark nights of Carter Mondale. But the important thing about this is that's a network that he was activating along with this positive network. This is as feel-good an ad as you can get, but he's making sure that he's making the comparison. I don't consider that illegitimate at all. I think that's simply a brilliant use of activating multiple networks at the same time that establishes what's good about you while trying to establish, you know, we weren't so proud, we weren't so strong, and we weren't so good before. To wrap up, I want to give you an example of a do I have time for one nefarious example? I want to give you an example of where I think the activation of networks is in fact unethical, and that is in the term support the troops, or support our troops. The reason why that is a problematic frame in George's language, in context in Frank's language, and you'll see my language about networks, we're getting at the same thing, is that it's essentially aligning two different networks that have nothing to do with each other, just as the war on terror allowed George Bush to align the war on bin Laden and the war in Iraq, which incidentally, we have won neither of those. But the war on terror was a very powerful way of framing it. What Support the Troops does is aligns a network about supporting our men and women in uniform, on the one hand, and deploying them to Iraq and keeping them in Iraq. Those things have no logical relation to each other whatsoever, but it has caught the Democrats over and over and over for their fear of being branded, that if we step out and say, I believe that it's time for a responsible withdrawal, or whatever they say, and they actually back it up with a vote, that they'll be accused of not supporting our troops. And just to conclude with a comment that gets to the kind of thing that George is talking about, how do you answer something like this? How do you not repeatedly capitulate in advance? You need to, as George is describing, you either need to be activating an alternative set of networks with a very powerful story behind it, or you need to connect this with something else. And just to give you an example of that, suppose the Democrats had said something like this. They could have done this as early as 2003, but certainly it should have happened in the 2004 election. It could certainly happen now. And it's something like this. Mr. President, you want to know what it means to support our troops? Don't make their families take up a collection for their body armor. You want to know what it means to support our troops? Armor their Humvees so they don't lose their lives and limbs when they don't need to. Do you want to know what it means to support our troops? Don't send them into somebody else's civil war. You want to know what it means to support our troops? Don't send them to war unless you would send your own children. You want to know what it means to support our troops? When they come home damaged, when they come home with their bodies frayed from that war, don't you dare warehouse them with cockroaches in Walter Reed Hospital. You want to know what it means to support our troops? When they come back to the shores that they will never see again, having given their life for this country, don't whisk their bodies in the middle of the night because it's good for PR for people not to see their bodies. You proudly display their flag-draped coffins like every American president has done in American history before you. You want to know what it means to support our troops? Don't you ever write letters to their parents, to their spouses, to their children when they've lost their lives for this country with a mechanical pen. You write it with your own hand so you feel what it means when they've lost their lives for this country. And you really want to know what it means to support our troops. Bring them home.
Thanks, everybody. We have about 20 minutes, and I'll ask the panelists questions for about 10 and have audience questions for about 10. The drill on audience questions is you have one of these in your seat, write your question on it, and people will come around and collect it, and then Andras will select which ones to hand to us. So we'll have to go, I wish we could spend 3 hours, but this is wonderful material, but let's just go quickly. First of all, Frank.
No, don't go to me.
Okay.
No, I'm just kidding.
I want to touch you again.
There's a thought I thought you didn't finish. You were saying President Bush isn't a good communicator. I thought there was a but coming. Why did he win twice? And how does his rhetoric work, and how does it work through his very large swings to super popularity, super unpopularity?
Bush won partially because John Kerry lost. If he'd used your rhetoric, your language, I hate calling it rhetoric because that demeans it. That kid in Florida that you heard about that was at one of these kind of speeches and he was heckling Kerry and they tasered him. Remember he said, "Don't taser me, man"? He was the first, he was the first person ever to be electrified from a John Kerry speech.
So don't you think, Mike
I had
Gerson...
so many more of those, but because that guy's heckling me over there...
Don't you think Mike Gerson is a genius? War on terror is a brilliant phrase?
No. War on terror is an awful phrase because the president used it exactly as you said to apply the issue of terror to the issue of Iraq, and now he has blurred both. And so the public's response is it is confused, it is angry, and that's one of the reasons why the support for the war is opposed. You cannot, evildoers, who created such a phrase like that? And that tells you how badly the Democrats have done, because the Republicans haven't done well in terms of communication. But the problem now is the MoveOn.org ad, the one that was in the newspaper, the full-page ad against General Petraeus. At the moment when the public was really turning against the war, and General Petraeus was brought before Congress and had to explain what had happened, instead of a discussion about the people who've been killed and the situation, What happened with the debate? It got moved, shifted to whether that ad itself was wrong or not. Here's the point for people in this room, because I know you all oppose the war. That ad was great for MoveOn.org. That ad raised hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, and email support for the ad and for the organization. So it doesn't, now you can save a little bit of money. You won the battle, but you lost the communication war. Instead of focusing on all the things that had happened, it shifted it to the ad. And if I were an activist Democrat, I would have been livid, because now it continues for another 6 months.
George, I'm going to override for a minute. I want to throw out, because time is passing so quickly, two very big questions and ask all of you, and you can go first, to sort of jump in on either or both of these. One, you know, I didn't hear a lot of support on this panel for the George Orwell position that if we can have a sort of plain-spoken, honest, reality-based political language, everything will be fine. So first question is, what's okay and what's not okay? At the end, Drew, you pointed out something you don't think is okay. Is there a principle you can state on kind of an ethics of political communication? So that's the first question. Second question, what do we know now, what do candidates and experts know now that FDR didn't know back in 1935? When did the science get to a point that a Hillary-esque level of communication sophistication became possible? How much of that is instinct and how much of that is science? So you start.
Well, that's a lot of questions. All right. First, what's legitimate? Say what you believe. Express the values you really have. You cannot do it without framing and without metaphor. So be effective. Use it effectively. And you can't just use it, make up some slogan in the air. You have to evoke frames that are already there. Just as you were saying, you have to evoke what is there already in people's mind. George Soros talked about the packaging of information. We all think in terms of the packaging of information because our conceptual system is in our physical brains. Culture is the packaging of information, and a personal identity is the packaging of information. You can't avoid it. So the question is, how do you use it legitimately and for the truth? Now, there is a problem, and the problem is the Enlightenment view of reason. That the assumption is that everything is conscious, that it doesn't use frames, that it doesn't use metaphors, etc. That is false, and we need to know that is false. We need to be armed with some understanding of cognitive science and neuroscience to know that it doesn't work that way. And what happens with the Democrats is the following. You get a certain number of people who are neoliberals. They have the progressive moral view that they care about people and they want to act responsibly on that care, but they can't reason about it because that would sound weak. Instead, they have to use reason about interests. And so what they do is they find some place where there has been some market failure for an interest group. It might be college loans, S-chip, veterans, whoever. And then they make up a program to help to get over that market failure by having regulations or subsidies or whatever to help that interest group. And that is exactly what's happening with the healthcare plans. That's why they're going to insurance instead of a non-insurance plan. They're not telling a truth. The truth was told by Michael Moore. Namely, insurance companies in health insurance make their money by denying care. They are the opposite of a market. In a market, the company that delivers the most product makes the most money. With health insurance, the company that delivers the least product, given their premium, makes the most money. The more they can deny you care, the more money they make. And that will always be true of insurance. So all of the plans out there are market failures waiting to happen. They're not willing. Yeah, Kucinich is one who is not, and so is Conyers. Okay. With 676 is now got 82 people in support.
Let's go on to Drew. Do you have answers to those questions?
No, but I'm an academic, so that doesn't stop me from speaking anyway. I've already lost the first one. It was about the
ethics of communication. If you don't say, just simply tell the truth in plain spoken terms and call things what they are, because life is more complicated than that, then what can't you say?
Okay. I think this is probably the only place where I disagreed with George, was that I thought the first part of that Orwell quote was absolutely correct. I think in many ways 1984 should have been called 2004 and been a critique of the Bush administration, but Orwell, of course, couldn't have known that. I think Orwell's essay on politics and English language could have been a wonderful critique of the Democrats' language, who offered turgid prose and facts and figures. I mean, the latest example being the most remarkable one, where here was a bill that was about making sure that working parents can take their sick kids to a doctor. Now, I believe that's plain language, and that's spoken in values-based terms. I just said what it's about, and Democrats ran around calling it S-chip.
Exactly.
Why would you ever do that? It's the same thing as it took from 2006. It took a year from 2006 to 2007 to finally start breaking the association of the war in Iraq and the war against Islamic terrorists. So when does the Senate invite General Petraeus to show up to give his testimony on the war in Iraq? On September 11th. Now, if you think in terms of networks, you wouldn't do that in a million years. That's the last date. General Petraeus should have been nowhere near the Senate or the House in September of this year. It should have been October if it had happened at all. I think I'll stop there. And
well, let me, Frank, jump in.
I learned my trade, my craft, from Bill Clinton. I did not know anything about language. I did not really begin to study it until 1993, 1994. When Bill Clinton reframed, it was no longer tax increases, they were revenue enhancements. That was Bill Clinton's phrase. In the same speech, it was the State of the Union address of 1996, he talked about, and I quote, ending welfare as we know it, and in the same speech, he had 11 programs that would, quote, assist the poor. What the heck is welfare? But he changed the dynamic, and I watched him in speech and language. This didn't exist to me until I watched Bill Clinton, and that's how I started to study the power of words and phrases, and it was Clinton that led me to the death tax rather than the estate tax.
Let me ask one last thing before, because we have audience questions that Andras is going to read, and that is going to the stated purpose of the panel. Does anyone have evidence that the science of understanding language and communications is actually being used by people on the ground today running for president and other offices in ways that simply were not available to Franklin Roosevelt? When did that start to happen? How do we know that's happening?
The dial technology that they saw wasn't available back then.
When did that become available?
They started to use that at the end of World War II to test advertising for the war. Madison Avenue adopted the technology in the mid-1950s. TV, the shows that you see on television, had two buttons, a red and a green one. They used that in the 1960s, and it was Dick Worthen who first used instant response in 1984 for Ronald Reagan, and then in the mid-90s I brought it to television.
Yeah, the Democratic candidates all over the country use Don't Think of an Elephant as a book to talk about values and to not use the other guy's frames. And I won't tell you how many letters I've gotten from candidates all over the country who won in red districts saying they figured out how to talk to conservatives. There's a section of the book that says you talk to conservatives by finding out where they already share your values, because they're usually biconceptual, usually partially progressive. And that's why Schweitzer won in Montana. He loved the land, and he knew how to talk to Montanans about that. I mean, this is something that's come out of cognitive science, which now gets out there to candidates who have begun to use it. They need to do a lot more. I want to say something about Richard Worthlin and trust. Worthlin, I spoke to Worthlin about what he discovered about Reagan. When he became Reagan's chief pollster and strategist, he did a poll, and he found out that almost nobody liked Reagan's positions on issues. They just wanted to vote for him. And so that he didn't know why they wanted to vote for his candidate. But when he studied it further with other focus groups and so on, he discovered that Reagan talked about values, not issues. If it was issues, it was to illustrate a value. He sounded like he believed what he was saying, and Wirthlin thinks he did believe what he was saying, so he was authentic. People therefore felt they could trust him, even if they disagreed with him, and therefore they could identify him with him. And so he ran the campaigns on values, authenticity, trust, and identity, not on issues. And that's what people are voting on. You ask about why people voted for Bush. Very clear, he ran his campaign on just those ideas, and there's a question of, is Bush smart? I was the linguist called in to study his early campaigns. In those campaigns, he never mispronounced the word. He spoke in syntactically complete sentences. He argued in classical debating form. Karen Hughes says he corrects her speeches to make them fit classical debating form, which he learned at Yale, studying with the same teacher as John Kerry. And what you find in the study of when he messes up in his speech, it's whenever he tries to talk about empathy and compassion, not when he's talking about the war. Right? He is not dumb. He is not inarticulate in general. He is smart. And when he talks about victory in Iraq, think about oil. That is, you know, Alan Greenspan got it right. Right now, the question about contracts, you know, for the distribution of oil contracts in Iraq, the main issue there is, will American oil companies get exclusive 30-year contracts where they will get 75% of the profits for over 30 years to build the infrastructure? If they get those are going to become our, quote, vital interests in Iraq, and we're not, and the people who want to keep troops there are to protect our vital interests, namely the people like Halliburton building all those oil facilities. That is part, when people say they're going to bring home our combat troops, they're not saying all of our troops, and they're not saying we're going to get rid of those oil contracts. They're not doing that at all. Oil.
Drew, last word, and then we'll go to questions, if you have a last word.
Just a quick word is that I don't know of the evidence of who's read what. I do know that Karl Rove put together a council of academic advisors who had access to, Karl Rove did, who had access to all the published material on implicit versus explicit racism, for example. And the ad put out by the RNC, we don't have time to cue it up, but that was run by for Bob Corker against Harold Ford Jr. It is difficult for me to imagine that someone did that with just incredibly good intuitive sense of how to run, how to create that ad. It included subliminal elements and functionally subliminal elements that I think you'd probably have to know that literature to do. Although, you know, just going back, Ronald Reagan did know how to activate conscious feelings that were stronger because of the unconscious, implicit racial issues below, like by saying things like able-bodied welfare loafers or welfare queens that immediately activated this person's black. Or the Willie Horton ad was an example that was used by George H.W. Bush.
Actually, in response to that, twice as many people heard about the ad than actually saw it. But again, this is where people got overactive, they got angry. If they just let the ad run its course, it would not have done the damage. The Democrats started yelling and screaming about the ad, and it caused people in Tennessee to look at it and go, oh, wow, I didn't know that. There are times, like right now, when it is better to be silent than it is to speak up and be and draw attention to a particular issue.
Andras, questions?
All right, thank you. Wonderful. We've been given permission to go about 10 minutes over, and it's a good thing, because if these cards are a kind of virtual poll, this has been a very successful panel indeed. But the first card I just can't resist reading, because after a day spent listening to opportunistic, nefarious, focus group, test-marketed, evil propaganda, it's sometimes really nice to hear something that's very honest in a way that I think only a young person can be. We are joined by many students here today, and I suspect that this is from one of them. And it's a compliment to the panel. It is really a great experience to be here and to listen to incredible speakers. I love the way the topic of propaganda has been discussed. I'm going with a clearer idea of the meaning of propaganda and how it spreads. I have learned a lot. So, I think we've achieved our purpose. We are in a public library, and this is why we're here. The second interesting thing about my comments, and I don't know, Frank, what kind of frames you've activated, and I don't know what relationship you have to Procter & Gamble, but about 95% of the cards refer to you. So I don't think New York hates you. New York loves you. They all want to ask you questions, and here's one of them. Mr. Lutz.
You know, you guys are all like my mom, basically.
They don't have cheesecakes.
Here's one, and this is perhaps the first. How would you advise Democrats to reframe beyond Dr. Westen?
His comment, the lines that he used, and I don't want to get into it because I do not want to use a four-letter word on television, but the language that you used in the troops is perfection. It's absolutely, it's 100%. I can see the dials going off in my head. I can see Republicans looking at it and saying that's brilliant. So that would be the first thing I do. Look, we talked about 2004. John Kerry. You're going to say this is so irrelevant and so superficial, but John Kerry never smiled during the 2004 campaign, ever. His wife is worth $1 billion. If my wife were that rich, I'd be high-fiving the sky. The problem is that Kerry looked just like the tree that threw apples at Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. We need to be able to relate to these individuals. However, this is 2008, and I can promise you that intellectual curiosity and knowledge and wisdom is going to be so much more important in 2008 than it was in 2004 or 2000. That's going to be the important context of the campaign, and that helps some candidates and hurts others.
Thank you. Or maybe it is you who's been telling Hillary to smile more. Somebody got the message.
What they have to do, one other thing, the Hillary laugh that you guys remember from about 3 or 4 weeks ago, of all the things that we've tested on her, that one tested the worst. Because what that said to viewers who saw it is that it is all manufactured. That someone told her, you get an embarrassing question, you laugh. Jon Stewart put all of those 5 shows together. We showed that, and it's called, and you hate the phrase, it's called the Hillary cackle. We need genuine. We need honest. And that comes across as being dishonest.
All right, George, actually, you can pick up on this because the next one is for you. And by the way, history is being made here today because George and Frank are on stage for the first time ever. Thank you, thank you. George, in particular, but anyone can take this. Can you actually cite some examples of how and where Democrats have effectively reframed a Republican argument or slogan?
There have been a number. For example, if you take the issue of occupation, Jim Webb successfully used that in Virginia, where he talked about, he didn't use war and terror at all. He talked about our occupation there and said you can't win an occupation, you can only withdraw, and he won in Virginia. Very, very clearly. That was a most obvious case. The cases of the candidates in Montana who love the land, and they understood that Montanans love the land, but they would never call themselves environmentalists. They never used sustainability or any of those things. They talked about the land, they talked about water, they talked about cattle being poisoned, etc. They said it right. They addressed the people who, in their language, who shared their values, and they understood when they shared their values. They got it right. Those are obvious examples. We could go into more, but I want to say something about trust, and I want to respond to George Soros's question this morning about whether people care about truth. And I think the answer is yes, but there's a very interesting Berkeley study that was done about 30 years ago on the understanding of the word lie. And a lie turns out to have 3 components. The question is, does somebody believe or not believe what they're saying? Are they trying to deceive you in some way that is either to harm them or harm you or help themselves? And is it true? The least important is whether it's true in this. The most important is whether they're trying to deceive you and whether they believe what they're saying. That is what authenticity and trust are about. And that's what Wirthlin found out when he was working with Reagan, and that's what these candidates in the Republican Party understand. They try to project truth and authenticity. Truth is not an issue there. Now, people do, because when they ask people in the same study, what is a lie? They say something that's not true. And there's a reason for that I won't go into. It's a little more complicated, and it's well understood why that's the case. But the point here is that they do care about truth, but the way they see truth is through authenticity and trust.
Okay,
can I just add a piece to something George said? Just one other example that comes to mind. It was not from a campaign. It was Al Gore in An Inconvenient Truth versus Al Gore in his inconvenient campaign. And
we have a lot of great one-liners on this panel.
There's a specific example I just wanted to get. I'll make it very quick. It was at the end of the film when, instead of talking about global warming is a serious crisis, blah, blah, the way that Democrats normally talk about it, he said it with intonation like this, and I remember it to this day. I only saw the movie once. He said, "This is our only home."
I have one more question because we got to go. And this is from a certain gentleman in the front row to a gentleman up here who proposed that he might be adopted by him. and it refers to the distinction between deception that is put forward deceptively versus deliberate deception. And the question is there anything wrong with the deliberate deception in politics, like, for example, accusing Mr. Soros of being responsible for the Petraeus ad? Or is that okay to just, it's part of politics to deceive?
He's not responsible. A group that he's helped put out an ad that was very damaging. I feel bad. If I were on, as I said, if I were on that side, it would have upset me tremendously because it changed the focus and would have ended up hurting my cause. May I do one thing? Because I really believe, it's one of the reasons why I've left politics, that at times of great distress, as we have in this country, with tremendous anxiety and fear of the future, that language can be used to pull us together. Bobby Kennedy delivered what I believe to be the most powerful language, the most anti-Orwellian language in modern politics on the night that Martin Luther King was killed. And I've tried to memorize it, and I cannot. And it is, and I apologize for being required, but if I may take just 25 seconds. What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the U.S. is not hatred. What we need in the U.S. is not violenceness and lawlessness, but love and wisdom and compassion towards one another, and a feeling of justice to those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or they be black. So I ask you tonight to return home and say a prayer for the family of Martin Luther King, but more importantly, say a prayer for our country, which we all love, a prayer for understanding and compassion. We can do well in this country. We will have difficult times. We've had difficult times in the past, and we'll have them in the future. But in the end, it is not the end of violence, this is not the end of lawlessness, and it is not the end of disorder. But the vast majority of white people and the vast majority of black people in this country want to live together, want to improve the quality of our life, and want justice for all human beings that abide in our land. Let us dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world.
I think that's a perfect last word for this panel. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, panelists. And we will reconvene at 4:10. Thank you very much.